Thank you very much for having me here this evening, and I hope to share with you in the next hour or so a little bit more about a very special place to me, Old Hastings Mill Store Museum, and its background. Okay, so of course, obviously it began with trees, and how over eons of time trees took hold and flourished in the region that would become known as the Pacific Northwest. The early Indigenous inhabitants of the region developed techniques for harvesting only what they required from trees while allowing them to continue growing. So there's an example of a culturally modified tree. They were used for a variety of purposes: shelters, ceremonial poles, woven baskets, tools, bentwood boxes, dugout canoes, the list goes on, as you can imagine. So after contact, the journals of Pacific Northwest explorers like Captain George Vancouver described the incredible wealth of resources in the Pacific Northwest region. So the word got out, and took a while for things to get rolling. But in 1864, an Englishman by the name of Captain Edward Stamp arrived in Burrard Inlet with plans to build a sawmill. He initially chose land on what was known as the Military Reserve, which we know today as Stanley Park, but he later wrote a letter to the Colonial Secretary, Arthur N. Birch, requesting a different location. And here's Stamp's request in his own writing, which is up in the archives of UBC. Place likely to suit us is a point about halfway between the present mill site and the end of the new road, I believe also a reserve. By the new road, he's actually referring to the road to New Westminster that we now know today as Kingsway. So Stamp was eventually given permission to lease 100 acres of land at $100 per acre. He obtained fresh water for powering the mill machinery, and that would be delivered by flume from Trout Lake. That was the plan. He commissioned the building of the sidewheel steamer Isabel using Burrard Inlet timber, and Isabel was launched in Victoria on July 28th, 1866. So this is a real showpiece designed to show everyone what could be done with the local timber stock. So Stamp's Mill, as it was called, officially opened for business on April 13th, 1867. And there's a fairly small ad in the British Colonist of Victoria. The mill would be able to turn out, in Stamp's words, up to 70,000 board feet of lumber per diem. So he had a lot of confidence in his new operation. There was zero tolerance for alcohol at Stamp's Mill. And of course, this didn't sit very well with John Gussie Jack Dayton, who came along on September 30th, 1867. And he arrived up on shore just west of the mill boundary, and he soon found plenty of volunteers to help him build a sawmill. To build a saloon. Let me rephrase that. So Stamp's Mill initially enjoyed success as ships came calling from ports overseas. And advertisements extolling the virtues of Burrard Inlet lumber were placed in foreign newspapers like this one that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald. That's Sydney, Australia. So as the mill progressed and more people started coming into the town site, Stamp decided that it was time to have a company store. So he decided that his store would be built right on the water, atop pilings on the waterfront. And those pilings were, of course, hammered into the seabed with a steam-driven pile driver, like the one you see there. Here's an artist's conception of the new store, completed about 1868. The common belief is it was completed in 1865, but we fine-tuned that a little bit from the research that that has been carried out. But all was not well with Stamp. He resigned in January of 1869 after having disagreements with his work colleagues and financiers. So for a time, the mill had to close. On February 23rd, 1870, it was sold to an English firm by the name of Heatley and Company, and it reopened in August of that same year as the Hastings Sawmill Company. And there we have Mr. Hastings, George Fowler Hastings, and he was the commander-in-chief of the British Pacific Naval Fleet from 1866 to 1869. So he was kind of a celebrity back in the day. Nova Scotia-born Captain James Raymer took over as the new manager of Hastings Mill. He was meticulous about cleanliness, and he quickly expressed his displeasure with the appearance of the downsite when he first arrived. He actually came with Stamp. His first words were, "What is the meaning of this aggregation of filth?" There were a lot of Hawaiians working on the mill site, and they had chickens and they had pigs. And everyone was running amok, as you can imagine, so it was a little bit of a mess. But Raymer had things cleaned up pretty quick. March 1st, 1870, the growing town site west of Hastings Mill was officially named Granville in honor of British colonial secretary Granville Levison Gower, the second Earl of Granville. Now we have what I like to call the Alexander influence. Richard and Emma Alexander were a young, attractive couple who arrived at Hastings Mill in 1870. Originally from Scotland, Richard had experience in retail, and he would become the new manager of Hastings Mill store. England-born Emma immigrated west aboard the bride ship Tynemouth. It was hoped that the ladies of the bride ships would provide a stabilizing Christian influence for single young men in the British Crown colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia. It's kind of a social experiment. There's Richard and Emma. So this is a fascinating photo, which we actually have on display at the museum. Hastings Sawmill and its town site as they appeared in 1872. So I've flagged the mill and the store. You can see the Princess Louise tree in the background. And there was a school, Hastings Sawmill School, opened in 1873. And Miss Georgia Swinney was hired as the first school teacher at a salary of $40 per month. December 13th, 1873, Nurse Emily Patterson delivered Emma and Richard Alexander's son, Henry Osborne Alexander. And he was the first white baby to be born at Hastings Mill town site. Granville Post Office opened in the entry vestibule of Hastings Mill store on April 1st, 1874. It was one of 3 post offices on Burrard Inlet. So by now, Hastings Mill was becoming a highly successful operation, turning out up to 75,000 board feet of lumber per day. May 15th, 1881, St. James Anglican Church on Hastings Mill property was dedicated before a full congregation. That's quite a historic photo. Has anyone seen that before? It's quite a frequently used in Vancouver historical books. Sadly, Captain James Raymer died of heart disease and kidney failure on July 30th, 1882, and Richard Alexander would become the new manager of Hastings Mill. Now we have Calvert Simpson on the scene. In September of 1884, a young Englishman by the name of Calvert Simpson became the new manager of the store. And in later years, he would share many memories with Vancouver City archivist Major James xʷməthkʷəy of his early years as storekeeper. There's Calvert and Ada, taken in 1904. Here's a few of Calvert's memories. So I'll let you have a look at these and see for yourself what kind of an interesting guy he was. Store carried canned fish, vegetables, underwear, especially red, it's a cure for rheumatism, and lanterns. Nearly everyone carried a lantern in town because there were very few street lights back in the day. Now, I'll let you have a look at this. This is an early page from a counter book in 1884. So you can see some of the things that were sold at the mill at this time. We've got hand saws, hemp packing, horseshoes, horseshoe nails, ship's augers, lots of hardware. And this one I found particularly interesting. This was an entry from Christmas time, holiday time, December 1884. So you'll see there's a few festive sounding things on the counter book page there. A lot of Indigenous involvement at the store. This is xʷməthkʷəy. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. He was also known as Jericho Charlie of the Squamish Nation. And he would deliver oats, hay, and barley from Hastings Mill store to the local logging camps. People of many different nationalities lived and worked at Hastings Mill. And Chinook jargon was the language that was spoken to bridge communication barriers. Now, if you look closely here, you'll maybe recognize a few words that we still use today. The odd one, chuck, Sgsmåkemchuck, Musqueam, thanks. They were generally derived from local Indigenous conversation, English, French, maybe a smattering of Hawaiian. Unfortunately, the language has all but died out now. So, summer of 1884, Canadian Pacific Railway Superintendent William Cornelius Van Horn travels west to view the railway construction. And he decides that Granville, rather than Port Moody, should be the railway's western terminus. There's Mr. Van Horn, and he was very firm about how he was going to acquire land. The only question to be settled with the owners of the Hastings property is how much land they're prepared to give to the company. Straightforward. And so the city of Vancouver, its name recommended by Van Horn, was officially incorporated on April 6, 1886. Recognize it? It's changed a little, hasn't it? Now here's another famous historical photograph. This is looking south on Carroll Street from Maple Tree Square in May of 1886. The sign on the tree is advertising the city's first election. So the race is on for who is going to be Vancouver's first mayor. Is it going to be Richard Alexander of Hastings Mill or Malcolm McLean, who's a relative newcomer? Both of them are Scots, both of them are good looking, and the race was very close, but McLean was elected the mayor, much to Richard Alexander's surprise, I'm sure. By early 1886, Vancouver was expanding with the anticipated arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Lots of activity going on in the woods. Now, to save time and effort, the loggers used a bowling pin technique. So the big trees were cut strategically so they would knock down smaller trees as they fell. So through the spring months of 1886, there was this huge pile of downed trees on the edge of town, waiting to be stripped of their foliage and taken to the sawmill. As you can imagine, catastrophic thing happened, the Great Vancouver Fire of 1886, June 13th, 1886 to be precise. A massive interface fire bore down on the newly incorporated city. Now, there were between 1,000 and 3,000 residents living in the city at the time, and there was little warning as the fire approached. It descended down very quickly through this massive pile of deadfall and caught everyone off guard. It began as a small clearing fire near the north shoreline of False Creek, and a gentle offshore breeze fanned the flames of the clearing fire to life. And this was the result. So this is quite a famous map, which we actually have on display at the museum. And it shows how the fire literally took a dead hit on the city of Vancouver from its origin down by the roundhouse turntable, future turntable. And you can also see that Hastings sawmill was very fortunate because it was just east of the trajectory, just missed the main onslaught of the fire. So Vancouver burned to the ground in less than an hour. There's one building left standing in Vancouver. That was the Regina Hotel, which you can see in the background there, just to the left of the tent in the foreground. You can see that most of Hastings Milltown site survived unscathed. This picture was actually taken just a month after the fire. So all the prominent structures were still there, the Alexander residence, the original supply depot, which also served as a store prior to the Hastings Mill store. There's the roof of the Hastings Mill store, cookhouse in front. Everything was still intact, almost everything. So looking at a map, you'll see really just how fortunate the sawmill was to escape as well as it did, because a few places were lost. So Hastings Mill store became a makeshift hospital. Many families who had been separated while running from the fire reunited at the well-known landmark. And here's Calvert Simpson saying how people were clamoring for food. So the store was open night and day for 2 or 3 days. Now, Richard Alexander was on the other side of Burrard Inlet at the time of the fire. And so it was his wife, Emma, who fought hard to save her family home and the livestock. In the days to come, she would provide much comfort and care to fire refugees. The rebuilding of Vancouver progressed rapidly. Here's Cordova Street, 5 weeks after the fire, looking west from Carroll. May 23rd, 1887, the first Canadian Pacific Railway transcontinental train arrived in Vancouver. Crowds of people gathered along the waterfront to witness the historic event. And there's that classic picture of Engine 374 coming into Vancouver. Anybody been down to see the engine and the roundhouse? It's quite amazing. That must have been a monumental day. So in 1888, a new, larger Hastings Mill store was built along the 1868 original. So what they did was they built a false front across the new store to cover up the old store. So the new store's main entrance faced land rather than the sea. Still built on pilings, though. So now the next thing that was needed was fresh water to power the machinery at Hastings Mill. So a plan was in the works to pipe fresh water from Capilano River to Vancouver. The flume was still in place from Trout Lake, but it was not efficient. It was getting clogged with leaves, and beavers were cutting down trees around it, and fish were jamming it up, and so it just wasn't working. And they needed something better. So here's our professional diver, Richard Llewellyn, I think that's the pronunciation in Welsh, and he's hired to determine the best location for laying pipe across the bottom of Burrard Inlet. He had to walk back and forth 3 times across the bottom of Burrard Inlet. Very brave guy. And everything came to fruition on May 26, 1889. Vancouver Daily World reported that water is now in the city mains. So August 15, 1889, Richard Alexander placed an order for manufacturing and general purposes about the mill by metric measurement, 30 cents per 1,000 gallons. So there's his original order. And here's the order from Calvert Simpson. He also applied for water usage. And there's a signature down there. And you'll notice that as his address, he listed opposite Hastings Mill store. There weren't any house numbers, I guess, back then, or business numbers. So. But everybody knew where Hastings Mill store was. 1889, pioneer lumberman John Hendry, owner of the Dominion Sawmill Limited in New Westminster, purchased the Hastings sawmill, and he incorporated BC Mills Timber and Trading, which would become the largest manufacturing business in the province. There he is, well-known lumber king back in the day. He became very wealthy and very influential, owned a number of businesses. So his first order of business upon purchasing Hastings Mill was a major renovation and upgrade of the mill. John Henry was very much into machinery, so we got steam donkey engines rolling in the forest. They were newly invented. They would largely take the place of oxen and revolutionize the transport of cut logs in the woods. He began using the steam locomotive for transporting lumber. This is Old Curly. I tell the story in the book about how Old Curly got its name. And the steam engines also began making their appearance in the camps. John Henry was indeed the showman, and he was very proud of his business, and he wanted to showcase BC lumber. So he commissioned the cutting of a mass section of timber 120 feet long by 3 feet square for the 1890 Toronto Industrial Fair. There were some problems that came up despite all this advancement of technology and improvements, and there were some very difficult times in the early years of the 1890s. There was tragedy. This was just one case. July 11th, 1892, Hastings Mill tallyman Charles Scott was severely injured on the job, and he would successfully sue the company for $2,500. Quite a sad accident for him. A worldwide series of bank and business failures during the Panic of 1893 forced the closure of most BC sawmills. Hastings Mill continued with operations, but its company-owned logging camps were shut down. And back then, history has repeated itself lately. There was flooding during the spring of 1894, and that caused major damage in the Fraser Valley and beyond. And many people would lose their homes, and railways would fall into disrepair, and took weeks to be repaired. So that would have impacted business at Hastings Mill for sure. August of 1894, several shacks and the remains of the Squamish community of Gumgumbalai which was located just east of Hastings Mill. All these properties were demolished and burned where they sat. They were considered an eyesore. So that was, a very tragic moment for the Indigenous people. 1897, the local economy is improving thanks to the discovery of gold in the Klondike, heady days in Vancouver. But unfortunately, around the same time, Hastings sawmill burned to the ground on October 26, 1898. So it wasn't as fortunate as in the aftermath of the Great Vancouver Fire. The sawmill, as you can see, was completely destroyed, but other structures on the town site survived. So by the late summer of 1899, the sawmill was once again fully operational. Bigger and better than ever before. It would be capable of turning out up to 200,000 board feet of lumber per day. Really interesting reading these old newspaper clippings. And this is an unusual shot because it's one of the few interior shots we've got of Hastings Mill. There's an interior view of the rebuilt sawmill about 1900. And you can just imagine that giant saw going back and forth and cutting through some phenomenal sized pieces of lumber. And this was a red letter day at Hastings Mill, September 30th, 1901, the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York. The future King George V and Queen Mary came to visit Hastings Mill. A little bit hard to pick out in this photograph, but I believe that's the Duchess of Cornwall in the long black dress just to the left of the white rope there, the right-hand side of the gathering. There's a lady there with a long white dress, and then there's a lady behind her wearing a black dress. So that would be the future Queen Mary. And as you can see, they really dressed up the mill for the occasion, tried to make it look as little like a mill as possible, in my opinion. So BC Mills Timber and Trading once again expanded its empire with the purchase of Moodyville Sawmill on the North Shore in 1902. This is an interesting character by the name of Edwin Caton Mahoney. And he was an employee with BC Mills Timber and Trading, and he developed a line of prefabricated houses. So these were houses that could be pieced together, section by section, like a big jigsaw puzzle. And it would make construction fast and easy for novice carpenters. One of the finest examples became the head office for BC Mills Timber and Trading at the entrance to Hastings Mill. And the beauty of it was the interior rooms of the head office were paneled with examples of high-quality lumber from BC forests. So it's a real showcase building. It showed just what we had to offer in the way of quality timber. So as timber stocks started to deplete, Hastings Mill logging camps were located further and further up the BC coast. So here's a few of them. We had Grafton Lake on Bowen Island. We had Granite Bay on Quadra Island, Bickley Bay on the mainland, remote part of the mainland. And we also had Rock Bay on Vancouver Island. I can imagine that life in the remote camps was not for the frail or the faint of heart. Very wild, remote country. But there were bright spots, like Rock Bay, which evolved into a community with a store, a hotel, and it also had Union Steamship service. The Reverend John Antle, a Vancouver Anglican clergyman, persuaded Richard Alexander to fund the construction of a hospital, Queen's Hospital in Rock Bay in 1905. So the Rock Bay Hospital, Queen's Hospital, opened on July 9th, 1905. The head nurse is Miss Jean Sutherland on the far left. But unfortunately, life was difficult, as you can imagine, up there, and Jean Sutherland died of pleurisy on June 5th, 1906, less than a year following her employment. And many of her coworkers and loggers said that she worked herself to death. Hastings Mill continued to be a viable operation at this time, and ships continued to call regularly from a wide variety of ports to load lumber. Just a few of the ships. And it's quite an interesting photograph. A group of Hastings Mill workers posing on top of one of their finished products. Of course, today we would recognize this as old growth forest. A little bit politically incorrect, but at the time it was quite a show of pride. And British Columbia toothpicks were transported by rail to eastern markets. And we used that photo as our cover photo for the book. John Hendry owned one of the very first gasoline-powered automobiles in Vancouver. There's a famous photo of him in front of the hollow tree with his wife and daughter, a chauffeur, and a friend. He was also a very lucky man, very fortunate, because he canceled his reservation on the Titanic to attend his daughter Aldwyn's wedding on May 14th, 1912. Aldwyn was married in England. The whole family were over in England, and he decided to cancel his reservation home. So it was a bit of a subdued wedding. Now we come to the era of the Great War, the First World War. So with the onset of war, there were, of course, horrific losses on the battlefields overseas. And this would have directly affected Hastings Mill. And there were also passings on the home front, not to be forgotten about. Three prominent figures of Hastings Mill passed away during this time. Richard Alexander, January 29th, 1915. Emma Alexander, June 3rd, 1916. And John Hendry, July 17th, 1916. Kind of a little cluster of deaths, so you can't help but wonder that the war might have impacted their lives. Created a lot of stress. So Eric Werjhamber, the son-in-law of John Hendry, took over the management of BC Mill's timber and trading. And he would see dramatic changes in the coming years. And I'm sure some of you have heard the name Eric Werjhamber. Very handsome, dapper guy, as you can see, and a crackerjack businessman, the ideal hair, and of course he was married to John Hendry's daughter, Aldwyn. Real power-broken couple. On September 23rd, 1919, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, visited Hastings Mill. Now, he was only 19 years old, so I kind of questioned just how interested he really was in the goings-on, but the press really treated him like the media darling and reported that he watched with considerable time and interest at the activities and operations of the mill. And of course, we all know what happened with him eventually. And so by now, large sections of the Vancouver waterfront are being sold off to build new port facilities. So by 1922, Valentine Pier was under construction, just adjacent to the mill. September of 1925, after many months of negotiation, it was announced that the Vancouver Harbour Board had purchased the Hastings Mill property. $10 million in federal funding was being allocated for new port facilities. So the mill was given permission to continue on for the next few years, but everything was slated for demolition. The sawmill, the structures of the adjacent town site, everything was earmarked to be torn down. And of course, this included the old Hastings Mill store, which was starting to look a little bit dilapidated by 1925. And an equally dilapidated old Curly sat next to the store, as they couldn't decide where to put her. But eventually she was actually restored for a Hastings Park exhibition, the Peony grounds. Now we enter a new era for Hastings Mill Store involving the native daughters of British Columbia. And so with many of British Columbia's early pioneers aging and dying off, efforts were being made to honor their memory and their significant contributions to the growth of the province. So early in 1919, a group of born in BC ladies united to form the Native Daughters of British Columbia, post number 1. So in the early days, it was really more of a social club. They had a lot of get-togethers, autumn teas, garden fetes, birthday celebrations, meetings, charity work, and there was a lot of activity being documented in the local papers. But May 17th, 1926, they decided that it was time for them to have their own clubhouse. So native daughter Helen Smith wrote to the Honorable Thomas Petillo, Ministry of Lands, to inquire about leasing a vacant patch of land fronting English Bay at Alma Road. The daughters wanted to have a building constructed there for the safekeeping and display of historical relics. This is Helen Smith, one of the leaders at the time. So she thought that a suitable building should be erected immediately in a prominent location close to the university, and at the same time, be easily accessible from the city of Vancouver. And the daughters received the response they were hoping for. They were given permission to lease this land. Thomas Petillo wrote that the government favorably considers leasing 100 feet of frontage at a nominal rent, and it's understood that a suitable building will be erected, which will house historic relics to be on view to the public. So fast forward a few years, and in the spring of 1930, the Native daughters learned of the impending demolition of the old Hastings Mill store. So Native daughter Jessie Greer Hall, she is the one who spearheads the campaign to save the store. Now, you may be familiar with her from past Historical Society presentations, but her father was Sam Greer, and he lived at Greer's Beach, now Kitsilano Beach, and his home was demolished and burned by order of CPR developers in 1891. So she would have felt very passionate about saving the old mill store. She didn't want to see history repeating itself. So the Native daughters approached the Harbour Board, the owners of the mill store at the time, and they were told that they could have it free of charge, but it had to be relocated at their own expense, and it had to be relocated quickly. So they decided that they would need to raise $10,000 to have the building barged to Alma Road and refurbished as a museum. This would have been a tall order, as you can see, in the heart of the Depression, barging that building from its original site right around Stanley Park and across English Bay to the new location. But the donations started to roll in. One of the first was from Frederick Alexander, the sole surviving son of Richard and Emma Alexander. And he was quite proud of the fact that he was the oldest living representative of the early days of Vancouver, as his time dated back to 1870. So he was happy to help them out. There's the house mover, Frederick Goss, and he was hired to move the store to its new location. He was originally from Newfoundland, and he was the go-to person in Vancouver of the day for house moving. And this picture, unfortunately, is a little bit grainy, but we took it actually from the video that we've got of the barging. But there you can see the daughters keeping an eye on progress as the store is readied for departure. Gives you a bit of an idea. And there's the store afloat, July 29th, 1930, towed to English Bay waters off Alma Road by Captain Charles Cates aboard the tugboat Alert. Longtime Burrard Inlet tugboating captain, Captain Cates, waived the $89 towing charge. That was just one of many in-kind donations that the ladies received. So aboard at Skszwx, the Hastings Mill store was moored in English Bay to await the rising tide. And then with a large crowd watching and cheering on shore, the store was safely beached near the north end of Alma Road. I love this comment from Frederick Goss, because it really puts into perspective just what he was working with. It's standing the strain well. What stuff they put into that old building. Real lumber. And how well those pioneers did their work. I don't find many buildings so staunch and strong after so many years. So the Native Daughters did this whirlwind 2-week fundraising campaign, and they managed to raise about $5,000 during their fundraising drive. That was about half of their projected goal. So in lieu of cash, many businesses offered construction materials and labor. This is Vera Patterson, the campaign chairman, and she was philosophical about the shortfall. She just said, "We'll cut our garment according to the cloth. This memorial will flourish. Of that, I have no doubt." And it's quite poignant because she had colitis and she actually passed away to only about a year or so after the store was relocated. So that was sad that she didn't get to see the full fruits of her labors. August 1st, 1930, Frederick Goss made final preparations to winch the store up the 20-foot escarpment to its new home. And as you can see, that's a vertical escarpment down there, so it must have been quite a challenge. So they winched the store up, tried to get more detailed information on winching, but I wasn't able to get too much information. But we got this still again from the moving footage. Gives you a little bit of an idea. Apparently the winch actually broke during the raising, and the whole store dropped 1 foot, which must have made some parts stop. But all was well, and they continued. Got the store up to the top of the escarpment. And unfortunately, we don't have too much footage of we don't have any footage of the store being rolled onto its permanent foundation. But you can see that over the next few months, many repairs and renovations were made, and this was the result, a beautiful new museum for the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors were a little bit reluctant at first, because they did consider it a bit of an eyesore, but I think the finished product was more acceptable. And there's the celebration of the fully renovated Old Hastings Mill store, held on January 10th, 1931, on a very rainy day. There's the commemorative plaque, which is unveiled by BC Lieutenant Governor Randolph Bruce. This is Native daughter Nora Hampton Bowl, who did a stellar job of collecting relics. She wrote to people all over the Lower Mainland and beyond and asked them if they had anything of interest that they would like to donate to the museum. So it looked like she quite enjoyed her task. I've got a whole chapter on her. And after collecting a number of relics over the months, the store was opened as a museum on January 16th, 1932. So that was opening number 2. They had the opening to celebrate the end of the Renos, and then another opening a year later to officially declare the building a museum. And it was opened by BC Premier Simon Fraser Tolmie. I love this comment from Mr. Tolmie. Back in the 80s, men were not afraid to work. They were not afraid to don a pair of overalls and hew their livelihood from the virgin forest. All well and good, but I think you should have given a little bit of recognition to the women as well. But that was the mindset of the day. At first, there was plenty of space at the museum. They didn't have a lot of things yet, so there was a lot of empty space. They did have a lot of dances and bridge events and, with all the extra space. But eventually that started filling up as more and more relics accumulated. The ladies received many interesting items, large and small, including an original horse-drawn handsome Vancouver taxi cab. This taxi cab was actually used at the intersection of Granville and Georgia during the fundraising campaign to draw attention to the cause. We have a pair of cannonades actually, and they were donated by Eric Hamber. They were likely the same ones that were brought out from England by Captain Edward Stamp in 1861 when he had a small sawmilling operation at Alberni. And unfortunately, these cannons have a bit of a dubious history because they were used to posture and intimidate the local Shishot community of Alberni. So we wrestle with this a bit. We think, should these be on display or should we be taken off display? And we've decided it's best that we tell the truth about them and use them as a learning tool. So that's what we do. July 26, 1888, the coastal supply and transport vessel, the SS Beaver, was wrecked off Prospect Point in Stanley Park. And because it was so close to land and accessible, picnickers could climb aboard and help themselves to pieces of wood and metal and make them into nice souvenirs, like these lovely goblets that were turned and lathed from some teak. Joe Forties is well represented at the museum, the English Bay lifeguard. As you know, he saved many lives and taught 3 generations of Vancouverites how to swim. So we have Joe's beautiful certificate of appreciation, which was awarded to him by the city in 1910. And it's still in immaculate condition. It's my personal favorite. So I always point that out to people when they come. And we also have his lantern. We have some melted cutlery discovered after the Great Vancouver Fire. This was discovered by Jessie Ross, one of the early Vancouver pioneers, and years later, she unfortunately lost her son in the Titanic, Hugo Ross, so she had a tragic life. This was a chair that was rescued during the fire, donated many years later by Mrs. Julia Woofer, still in very sturdy condition. We have an urn that was used to serve coffee to survivors of the fire. And of course, a wonderful display of Indigenous belongings. A lot of them were donated by former Rock Bay resident Mary DeBrisse. And up in Rock Bay, as I described, it would have been a very lonely existence, but Mary really embraced the Indigenous culture up there and amassed this huge collection of belongings, basketry and tools and carvings, and she donated a very large number of these items to the museum. So over the years, generations of Native daughters and friends have come together to support the Old Hastings Mill Store Museum. So there's been quite a kaleidoscope of ladies over the years. And some of the more recent ones include our longtime Native daughter, Eileen McRae, who served in many executive roles at the museum. We just lost her a couple of years ago, but I have really great memories of her. She was a wonderful person. And we've had Vancouver historian Chuck Davis come for a visit. He would often lecture at the museum. He was the main reason I got involved. I came to the museum and heard a lecture by him one night, and I got hooked. I'm sure some of you will recognize Ivan Sayers, fashion historian. So he's put on a lot of fashion shows at the museum, both with in-person models and fashion displays using mannequins. And when we have celebrity guests at the museum, we often recruit them to pour tea. So there's Ivan pouring tea. And here's former Parks Board Commissioner Constance Barnes pouring tea. We've had local actors come in and portray early Vancouver characters. Here's Dick Pugh and Gay LePage from United Players, and they agreed to come and portray Calvert Simpson and Emma Alexander. And they both did a fantastic job. Unfortunately, they've both passed away now, but we have really great memories of that day. And February 23rd, 2019, we had a celebration to mark the Native Daughters' 100th anniversary. So you'll see a few familiar faces there, I'm sure, and extended the invitation to our local politicians. And so Joyce Murray came along, and David Eby, and Colleen Hardwick, and Tricia Parker, and so it was a really great day. We've had community outreach programs. Here's Elsie with some of our Great Vancouver Fire artifacts, which were taken down to Gastown during the Vancouver Fire Department's 125th anniversary celebration event and put on display. So that was quite popular. And we have occasionally May Day observances. We have our May Queen come to visit the mill. And some of our younger members formed her court. At Christmas, we've had the Bergamasca Ensemble come and perform their Renaissance and Baroque music on vintage and contemporary instruments. We just had them back for the first time this past Christmas after the pandemic pause, and it was wonderful. And the museum was packed. I think we had over 90 guests in attendance. It was magical. This was a special day for me. We had a family reunion. Remember when I told you about Jessie Greer Hall, who had spearheaded the campaign to save the store? So her descendants all got together and visited at the museum. So we had a wonderful afternoon. We had a little tea party. The lady on the far right is Deborah Dean, and she is Jessie Greer Hall's granddaughter, whom she never met, but she has very wonderful memorabilia and a lot of information about her grandmother. We've had Indigenous performers come to the mill. And we've had Marissa Nahani come to perform the paddle song. This was the song that was sung by Indigenous first responders as they paddled across the inlet during the Great Fire. So she came and reprised that song for us outside the mill. And we gave her a special certificate of appreciation, thanking all those first responders from that day. Deborah Sparrow of the Musqueam Nation shared her knowledge of Coast Salish weaving with us. And there are still a lot of echoes of Hastings Mill. The site is long gone, but there were and there continued to be many reminders of that past era. Like, of course, the stumps that we see in the forests and Spirit Park and Stanley Park with those telltale buckboard notches in the side. Lots of those still around. Old rusting pieces of machinery in the forest. This one was sent to us by a friend on Vancouver Island. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it looks like it might be something to do with logging. This was quite fascinating. The remains of the old logging railway trestle at Rock Bay. My husband and I took a trip up to Rock Bay a few years ago and did some scouting around and took some photos. And really interesting experience. It's about 30 kilometers north of Cabell River and another 30 kilometers due east along a very washboard road. This little memorial garden, I believe, was on the site of the original Rock Bay Hospital, Queen's Hospital, where Jane Sutherland worked herself to death. And so I thought I'd leave a little rock memorial for Jane at that memorial garden. Old Curly is now on display at the Burnaby Village Museum, quite heavily restored, I think. It looks a little bit like the original. And of course, Trout Lake, the original source of fresh water for the mill, is now a popular recreational lake in John Henry Park. And John Henry Park is, of course, named after the mill manager. One of the more spectacular survivors is the former Hastings Mill office, which is now home to Mission to Seafarers Flying Angels Club. And you can access that just by going over the overpass on the north end of Main Street and doing the big cloverleaf circle around. And there's a parking lot at the end, and you can actually go in and have a look at the Mission to Seafarers. And it's a wonderful facility for visiting seamen and sailors, and lots of services for them. They can get referrals for medical care, dental care. They can get food as needed and have access to all kinds of services. So it's a really good charity. It's nonprofit. They do a wonderful job. The base of the old Hastings sawmill burner was a popular midget park for many years, popular with sunbathers, a little bit offshore. I think it's long gone now. So, as you can see, Hastings sawmill, as it appeared in 1872, bears very little resemblance to the same view of today's Port Metro, Vancouver. A lot more efficient, but not quite as much character, I would say. Now, times are changing at the store as well. So this past summer, we had a major renovation project on the exterior. We had the entire exterior of the building painted and trouble spots were dealt with, like our rotting facacia board on the front of the building. So there's the before, and there's the after. So this whole project was supervised by Rhino Design Incorporated, and we can really highly recommend them. They did a great job. And there's the finished product. The mill looks beautiful, doesn't it? We've adopted the original colors as they would have appeared in the heyday of the mill. That was whitewash with red trim. I asked John Atkin, who's knowledgeable on the subject, why white and red? And he said, well, those were the most accessible colors of the day, easily found in the hardware stores. So that's what we went with, and we love the result, especially with the autumn leaves around. So there's much more to be done at Hastings Mill, where it's an ongoing process. And we always need volunteers. Our volunteer pool has drastically depleted over the COVID years. We ask as little as 6 hours a month, or less if you wish. The shift is from 1 to 4, Saturday and Sunday. And people are most welcome to apply. We have a portal on our website, and we would certainly love to hear from you if you're interested in applying. The website is hastingsmillmuseum.ca, very easy to remember. We have a monthly blog telling various stories about the mill and what happens down there and some of the interesting people that have been involved. And all I can say is it's a great place to work. I've been down there for 12 years and I'm quite hooked, and it's very special. So I encourage you to come down if you haven't been, or check the website and learn more. The book, as I say, we got a few copies at the back there, $25 each. I'm donating all my royalties to the store, to the ongoing upkeep.
I hope you'll join me in thanking Lisa for her presentation tonight.
Thank you.